The day my daughter-in-law told me I was too old to understand documents, she was standing in front of my husband's altar. Incense smoke curled between us. 3 sticks, still burning, the ash holding its shape the way ash does when the air is completely still. My husband's photograph watched from behind the flame, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the way he always wore them, like he kept forgetting they were there. 31 years I had loved that forgetful habit. Now the photograph was all that remained of it. Lynn held the papers out to me with both hands, which looked respectful, but her eyes told a different story. Mom. Her voice was the kind of soft that costs something to produce. Practiced soft. You've been through so much. Let us handle the complicated parts. Just sign here, and we'll take care of everything else. You don't need to read all of it. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse. Silk, or something made to look like silk. Her nails were done. Her hair was pinned. She had dressed for this moment the way people dress for a job interview, carefully, deliberately, as if appearance could substitute for intention. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at her. I worked in a bank for 34 years, I said. She smiled. Not the smile of someone who has heard you. The smile of someone waiting for you to finish. Of course you did, Mom. You were wonderful. But this is different. Estate paperwork is very specific, very technical. Even lawyers find it confusing. She set the papers on the small table beside the altar, next to the ceramic cup of tea I had made for my husband's spirit that morning. You're grieving. You shouldn't have to carry this burden too. Just trust us. And then she said it, not loudly, almost gently, which made it worse. You're too old to understand documents anyway. That's what we're here for. My son Min stood behind her, near the doorway. He had his father's jaw, his father's shoulders, but none of his father's stillness. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. Not looking at me. Not looking at Lynn. Looking at the middle distance the way people look when they have decided not to decide. I did not say anything. I picked up the pen, my pen, the one the bank had given me when I retired, gold-tipped, heavy in the hand, the weight of 34 years pressed into 12 centimeters of metal, and I set it on the table beside the papers. Not signing, just setting it down. I'll need more time, I said. Lynn's smile tightened at the corners. Just slightly. If you were not watching for it, you would have missed it entirely. I was watching. Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. But her eyes moved to Min when she said it. And he finally looked at her. Just for a moment, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with giving me time. That was how it began, though in truth, it had begun long before that afternoon. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what kind of woman I was before grief made me invisible to them, before they looked at my white hair and my quiet hands and decided I had become someone who could be managed. My name is Nguyen Thi Hoa. I am 68 years old. I retired from Viet Tin Bank 3 years ago, after 3 decades working my way from teller to loan officer to branch manager to, finally, head of the credit division for the entire provincial branch. I reviewed loan applications. I caught fraud. I trained younger officers to read between the lines of documents, to find the number that didn't match, the date that didn't align, the signature that leaned at a different angle than the one on file. I was very good at this. My husband, Van Van Duke, used to say I could smell a forged document across a room. He said it with admiration. He was an engineer, precise in his own way, but his precision lived in steel and concrete. Mine lived in paper and ink. We had 2 sons together. Min, the eldest, who lives in this city and works in construction project management, and Tuan, the younger, who moved to Da Nang 12 years ago to run a small logistics company. Both boys grew up in this house, under this roof, with the mango tree in the courtyard that Duke planted the year Min was born, and that still produces fruit every summer, stubborn and faithful. When Duke became ill, kidney failure, slow and certain, it was Min and Lin who moved in to help. Tuan visited when he could, but Da Nang is far, and he had his own life, his own pressures. Lin cooked. Lin drove Duke to his appointments. Lin organized the medications and kept the calendar, and made herself indispensable in the way that certain people do when they sense an opportunity forming. I was not blind to this, but I was tired. Caring for a dying husband is a particular kind of exhaustion. It doesn't live in the body. It lives somewhere deeper, in the place where hope used to be. I let Lynn organize. I let her help. I thought, this is what family does. This is what it means to not be alone. 3 months before Duke died, on a Tuesday afternoon when the rain had been falling for 2 days straight, and the house smelled of wet concrete and camphor oil, he asked me to bring him his writing box. The old lacquered one, red and black, that had belonged to his mother. Inside was a notebook, and in the notebook, in his careful engineer's handwriting, he had written what he wanted done with everything we had built together. Equal shares. To both sons. The house to remain in the family. His workshop tools to Tuan, who had always been the one to follow him around with a wrench as a child. His books to Min, and to me, the right to live in this house for the rest of my life, undisturbed. I sat beside him while he wrote the final lines. I held the notebook steady because his hands shook. I watched him sign his name, the same signature I had seen on 30 years of bank documents and birthday cards and school permission slips, slightly slanted to the right, the D in Duke looping once before closing. I remembered that signature. I have always had a good memory. This is not something that leaves you simply because your hair turns white. After Lynn and Min left that evening, I sat alone in front of Duke's altar for a long time. The incense had burned down, just the sticks remained, pale and straight, holding their shape in the still air. Outside, a motorbike passed, then another, then quiet again. The mango tree moved once in a small wind, its leaves catching the last light from the street. I looked at the papers Lynn had left on the table. I did not touch them. I only looked. I had been in banking long enough to know that the most important thing about a document is never what it says on the surface. The most important thing is always the date, the witness signatures, the registration number, the chain of custody that proves, without doubt, where it came from and who authorized it and whether the person who signed it was capable, at that exact moment, of signing anything at all. Tomorrow I would read every line. Tonight, I sat with my husband's photograph and the cold cup of tea and the memory of Lynn's smile tightening at the corners. And I thought about something my grandmother used to say when I was a girl. She said it about rivers, but she meant it about people. Still water runs deepest. And the deepest water is the last place you want to be standing when it finally moves. I was still water. I had been still for a long time. I picked up my gold pen from the table beside the altar, turned it once in my fingers, set it in my pocket. Then I went to find my reading glasses. Duke built the bookshelf in the front room himself. This is one of the things I think about now, when the house is quiet and the evening light comes through the window, at that particular angle that makes the wood look almost golden. He spent 3 weekends on it. 3 weekends of measuring and sanding and holding pieces up against the wall to check the level, asking me to stand back and tell him if it looked straight. It always looked straight to me. He always found something to adjust. That was the year Min turned 7 and Tuan turned 2. The house was loud then, in the way that houses with small children are loud, a constant low hum of noise and motion, toys on the floor, someone always needing something, the television running in the background because silence felt strange. I was still at the bank, branch teller at that time, working the morning shift so I could be home by 3. Duke was on a construction crew building the new road outside the district center, coming home with concrete dust on his boots and his hair and sometimes on the back of his neck in a way that made me laugh when I brushed it off. We were not rich, we were not struggling, we were somewhere in the useful middle where you count carefully and plan ahead and find, most months, that the numbers work. The bookshelf took him 3 weekends. When it was finished, he stood in front of it with his hands on his hips and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "Well," I said. "It's not perfectly level," he said. "It's perfectly level. The third shelf is 2 millimeters low on the left side." I looked. I could not see it. "No one will ever notice." "I'll notice," he said. He never fixed it, but he never stopped noticing, either. Every time he took a book down or put one back, I would catch him glancing at that third shelf with the expression of a man who has made peace with an imperfection without quite forgiving it. That bookshelf is still in the front room. I have not moved it. I will not move it. We had been married for 6 years when I was promoted to loan officer. Duke took me to dinner at a restaurant with tablecloths, which was not a thing we did often. He ordered fish and a bottle of rice wine and gave a small toast that embarrassed me because the people at the next table could hear. To the smartest woman in the provincial banking system, he said. Stop. It's true. It's embarrassing. Both things can be true, he said and drank. That was Duke. He was not a man of many words, but the words he chose landed cleanly and stayed. He said what he meant. He meant what he said. In 31 years of marriage, I never once had to wonder which version of him I was getting, because there was only ever one version. This is rarer than people think. I know this because I spent 3 decades watching people sit across from loan officers and be one person on paper and another person entirely in practice. Duke was the same person on every surface. When the boys were growing up, he was the one who checked their homework with the engineering precision he brought to everything, not just for answers, but for method. How did you get to this answer? Show me the steps. Min found this tedious, and said so, loudly, in the way that firstborn sons often feel entitled to say things. Tuan sat beside his father with a pencil, and worked through the steps without complaint, asking questions, genuinely wanting to understand. I watched this, and did not say anything. You learn things about your children by watching how they learn. Min was always looking for the shortest path. Tuan was always looking for the right one. They were both my sons. I loved them both completely and not always equally, the way it actually is when you are honest with yourself in the dark. The house itself is old. My husband's parents built it when this neighborhood was still at the edge of the city, before the city expanded outward and swallowed all the open space. The walls are thick in the way that older construction is thick, holding heat in winter and cool in summer, the paint on the exterior fading to that particular shade of pale yellow that Vietnamese houses of a certain age tend to arrive at eventually, as if the sun decides for them. The altar room is in the back, near the courtyard. When Duke's parents died, we moved their photographs there. When Duke died, I added his. Now there are 3 frames arranged in a row, and I light incense in the morning before I do anything else. 3 sticks, the smoke rising and dispersing the way it does when you have done something enough times that your hands know it before your mind does. Duke chose where the altar should go. He was particular about it, not for superstitious reasons, or not only, but because he believed that the relationship between the living and the dead deserved proper geography. A corner facing the door, he said, so the light comes in when the house opens, so they can see who comes and goes. I have thought about that a great deal lately. So they can see who comes and goes. The months after Duke's funeral were a specific kind of quiet that I had not experienced before. Not peaceful quiet. Waiting quiet. The kind of quiet where the house seems to be holding its breath. Min and Lin had moved in before he died, to help with the care. I was grateful for this. I said so, and meant it. Lin organized everything: the medications, the appointments, the meals, the rotation of which relative came to sit with Duke on which afternoon. She was efficient. She was pleasant. She called me Mom with a consistency that I had initially found touching. After the funeral, they stayed. This also seemed reasonable. There was space. I did not want to be alone in the house. Not at first. Not while everything still smelled faintly of the camphor oil we had rubbed on Duke's hands in his final weeks. Having voices in the kitchen, footsteps on the stairs, the small domestic sounds of other people's lives, this helped. But somewhere in those months, the balance shifted. I could not have told you the exact moment. That is the nature of these things. They do not arrive at once. They arrive the way water gets into old walls slowly, through small gaps. And by the time you see the damage, you have to look back a long way to find where it started. Lin began answering questions that were addressed to me. Not rudely. Helpfully. The repairman who came about the water heater, she spoke to him before I could. The neighbor who asked about the property line at the back, Lin, explained it while I was still considering my answer. Small things, each one, individually, nothing. Together they formed a shape, and Tuan called less. I told myself this was because he was busy. He had always been busy. Always had a project. Always had a delivery to arrange or a client to meet. But there had been a time when busy Tuan still called twice a week. Now it was once. Then every 10 days. Then when I called him, there was a new hesitation in his voice. Something careful. Like a person who has been told a version of a story and is not sure it matches what they are seeing. I did not ask him about it directly. Not yet. I thought about what I knew. What I had seen with my own eyes, in my own house. in 31 years of a life built carefully alongside another person. I thought about Duke's writing box, the red and black lacquered box with his mother's pattern on the lid, the notebook inside with his careful handwriting, and his slightly right-leaning signature and the instructions for everything we had built. I had not seen that box since the week of the funeral. I had assumed it was somewhere in the house. I had not, until that evening with the incense and Lynn's tightening smile, thought to wonder where. I started looking for it the next morning. Not frantically. I am not a frantic person. I approached it the way I approached everything at the bank when something didn't reconcile methodically, starting with the most likely explanation and working outward from there. The box was somewhere in the house. Houses do not lose things. People misplace things, move things, set things somewhere, and forget the logic that seemed obvious at the time. I would find it. I began in the bedroom. Duke had kept the lacquered box on the upper shelf of the wardrobe, behind his folded dress shirts. This was where it had always lived, for as long as I could remember, pushed back against the wall, the red and black lid just visible if you knew to look. I opened the wardrobe doors and stood on the small step stool we kept in the corner and looked. The shirts were still there, neatly folded, which meant Lynn had organized them at some point, because in the months before he died, Duke had not been folding anything, and I had not been attending to wardrobes. The shirts smelled faintly of the cedar block someone had placed among them. Practical, thoughtful, the kind of detail that makes a person seem indispensable. The box was not there. I checked behind the shirts, moved them aside, felt along the back of the shelf with my hand. Dust and cedar, and the faint impression in the shelf lining where the box had rested for years, a clean rectangle against the slightly faded surface, the ghost of something recently removed. I stood on the step stool for a moment and looked at that rectangle. Then I stepped down and started on the rest of the bedroom. It took me most of the morning. I was thorough. The bedside table, both drawers, the lower shelves of the wardrobe, the space under the bed, which had not been swept recently and held 2 pairs of Duke's old sandals and a cardboard box of documents I had put there myself years ago, tax records, utility receipts, the kind of paper accumulation that every household generates and no one quite knows how to discard. I went through this box carefully. The lacquered box was not inside it. The notebook was not inside it. I did find, in a manila envelope near the bottom, the original deed to the house, my name and Duke's name, printed side by side, dated 23 years ago. I set this on the bed and kept looking. By noon I had checked every room except Min and Lynn's room, which I did not enter, and the small storage room off the courtyard where Duke had kept his tools. I went to the storage room last, pushed the door open into the smell of machine oil and old wood. His tool bench was still there. The pegboard on the wall with the outline markings he had drawn in pencil, so each tool went back to its exact position. Half the tools were still hanging in place. The others were gone. Tuan had taken them at the funeral, at Duke's specific request. The ones that remained looked orphaned somehow, hanging in positions that now seemed arbitrary. The lacquered box was not in the storage room. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the pegboard, at the outlines of the absent tools. Duke's system. A place for everything, so you always know where everything is, so the absence of a thing is immediately visible. I thought. The box has been removed from where it was supposed to be. This is a fact. The question is when, and by whom, and why. I did not ask Lynn directly that day. This requires explanation, because to some people, silence looks like passivity. Like a woman who doesn't know how to push back, who absorbs things and accepts them. In my experience, people who believe this about quiet women tend to be the same people who are later very surprised. I did not ask Lynn directly because I had nothing yet. A missing box is not evidence. It is an absence, and absences require careful handling. You do not name an absence until you understand its shape. I had worked in banking long enough to know that the person who asks too early gives away too much, tells the other party exactly what they have and don't have, exactly where to plug the gaps. I needed to know more before I let Lynn know I was looking. So that evening at dinner, I was pleasant. I ate the soup she had made, which was good. She was a genuinely good cook. I had never doubted this, and I listened to Min talk about a project delay at work, and I asked appropriate questions. And I said nothing about the mourning or the wardrobe or the clean rectangle in the dust where my husband's box used to be. Lynn watched me the way she had been watching me for weeks. Assessing. Calculating. I watched her back, but less visibly, because I had 34 years of practice watching people without appearing to. After dinner, she brought tea and sat across from me at the small table near the window. "Mom," she said, "have you thought more about the papers?" "A little," I said. "The notary's office needs them back by the end of the month. It's just a timing thing, administrative." She wrapped both hands around her tea glass, casual, unhurried. "I know it feels rushed, but these things have deadlines we can't control." "What notary's office?" I asked. She paused, a very small pause. "The one handling the estate. We mentioned it last week." She had not mentioned it last week. "I have a good memory." "I don't remember that," I said pleasantly. "You were tired," she said, equally pleasant. "You've been so exhausted. It's completely understandable." There it was again. The gentle insistence on my exhaustion, my confusion, my age. Each mention small enough to seem like concern. Accumulated, they formed something else, a record, if anyone was listening, of a woman whose mind could no longer be relied upon. "Which notary?" I asked. "Mr. Fuck. He has an office on Tran Hung Dao, near the Central Market. Very reputable. He handled a lot of the documentation when—" She paused, smoothed something invisible from her sleeve. "He helped us with some of the initial paperwork after the funeral. Very efficient." I nodded slowly. "I'd like to see his credentials sometime." "Of course," she said. "Whatever makes you comfortable." But something moved behind her eyes when I said it. Not alarm, exactly. More like a small recalculation. The expression of someone who has been moving pieces on a board and has just registered that one piece is not where they thought it was. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the bed that had been my bed and Duke's bed for 31 years, and I looked at the ceiling and I did the thing I had always done when a file didn't reconcile. I went back to the beginning and listed what I knew in order. Duke's notebook had been in the lacquered box in the wardrobe. I had seen it there 6 weeks before he died. The box was now gone. The estate papers Lynn wanted me to sign had appeared without explanation. She had named a notary I had not been told about. She had, repeatedly and consistently, emphasized my confusion, my tiredness, my inability to manage complexity. And Tuan had not called in 11 days. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. Duke's photograph on the small table. The one I kept near the bed different from the formal one on the altar. This one was from a trip we had taken to the coast years ago. His hair shorter, his face less lined, squinting into the light and not quite smiling. The expression of a man who is happy but hasn't thought to perform it. I looked at him for a while. Then I got up, went to the front room, and found the old address book I kept in the drawer beside the telephone. Tuan's number. I wrote it on a slip of paper and folded it into my pocket, which was unnecessary because I knew the number by heart. But having it written felt like preparation. Like the beginning of something that needed to be done carefully and in the right order. In my banking years I had caught 4 cases of document fraud. Not by confronting anyone, not by asking direct questions at the wrong moment, by finding the date that didn't align. I thought about what Lynn had said. The notary's office. The end of the month deadline. Administrative timing. I thought about Duke's signature, the one I had steadied the notebook for, the D looping once before closing. I thought, there is a date somewhere in those papers, and a date can be checked. I turned off the lamp and went back to bed. I did not sleep, but that was all right. I had never needed much sleep when there was a problem in front of me. This was a problem in front of me. I called Tuan the next morning, early, before Lynn was awake. The house at 6 in the morning has its own quality of light, thin and gray through the kitchen window. The courtyard still in shadow, the mango tree barely visible. I made tea the way I always make it, the same proportions, the same small ceramic pot Duke had bought at a market decades ago. Chipped now on one corner but still functional. Functional things deserve to be kept. This is something I believe. Tuan answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with the hour. "Mom? Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I'm calling early because I want to talk before the day gets busy." A pause. In that pause I heard him wake up fully. Heard the shift from half-sleep to attention. "Of course. What is it? When did you last speak to your brother?" Another pause. Longer. "Maybe 3 weeks ago. He called about the—" He stopped. About some paperwork. Said he needed my signature on something for the estate. And did you sign? He sent documents by courier. I signed and sent them back. His voice had taken on that careful quality I had noticed on his recent calls, the one that meant he was choosing words. He said it was just procedural. Transfer of administrative responsibility. He said you had already agreed. I held my tea with both hands and looked at the courtyard. I had not agreed, I said. I was not told. The silence on the other end of the line was the specific silence of a person realizing that two different versions of a story cannot both be true. Mum, what exactly did the document say? Do you still have the copies? Yes, I kept copies. I always keep copies. You taught me that. A rustling sound. Movement. I'll photograph them and send them to you this morning. Right now if you want. Please, I said. And Tuan, don't tell Min we spoke. The pause this time was brief. He had heard something in my voice. My son, who had always been the one to sit with his father and work through the steps, who had always been looking for the right path rather than the shortest one. All right, he said. The photographs arrived before 8. Tuan had photographed each page carefully, good light, no shadows obscuring the text, all four corners visible. He had always been thorough. I had always been grateful for this. I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and looked at them on my phone, enlarging each page in turn. The documents were typed. Formal language, the kind that sounds authoritative and means very little unless you know what to look for. Transfer of estate administrative authority, designation of primary representative for property matters. Standard phrasing, mostly. The kind of thing that could be explained away as procedural, if you were inclined to explain things away. But I was not looking at the phrasing, I was looking at the dates. The notarization stamp was at the bottom of the final page. Round, official, the ink slightly uneven on one side, the way rubber stamps sometimes are when they've been in use for a while. The date on the stamp was clear. I read it twice. Then I went to the small drawer in the kitchen where I kept medical records, the habit of a woman who worked in documentation for 3 decades, who understood that paper is the only thing that cannot be argued with after the fact. I had kept everything from Duke's final months. Every hospital visit, every test result, every pharmacy receipt, every consultation note. I found what I was looking for in the third folder. Hospital admission record. The provincial hospital, internal medicine ward. Duke had been admitted for respiratory complications, a consequence of the kidney failure, in the final difficult weeks. The admission date was printed clearly on the form. The discharge date. There was no discharge date, because he had not been discharged. He had died in that room, quietly, on a Tuesday morning, with me on one side and the window on the other. I placed my phone on the table next to the admission record. I looked from one to the other. The date on Tuan's documents, the date on the notarization stamp, the date on which my husband had supposedly reviewed and approved the transfer of administrative authority, the date on which he had supposedly been competent and present and capable of authorizing anything, was 4 days after his hospital admission. 4 days after the date on the record I was holding in my hand. 4 days during which Duke had been in a hospital bed, conscious only intermittently, his hands too weak to hold a cup, speaking in half sentences that trailed into silence. He had not reviewed those documents. He had not approved them. He had not been capable of authorizing anything during those 4 days, and anyone who had been in that hospital room would have known it, and the only people who had been consistently in that hospital room, besides me, were Min and Lin. I sat with this for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the city was waking up the first motorbikes, a vendor's call somewhere down the lane, the neighbor's radio playing something low and indistinct. Ordinary sounds. The day arriving on schedule, indifferent to what I was holding in my hands. I am not a person who panics. I have dealt with fraud before, in the professional sense, and I know that the first response to discovering a discrepancy must never be the emotional one. Emotion is for later, for private moments, for the dark, after everyone has gone to bed. In the moment of discovery you must stay in your mind, you must continue listing what you know. What I knew. The notarization date on Tuan's documents did not match the hospital admission date. The documents had been notarized on a day when my husband was incapacitated. This meant the notarization was fraudulent, or the date was wrong, or my memory of the admission date was wrong. I did not believe my memory was wrong. But I verified it anyway, because that is what you do, you verify everything, even the things you are certain about, because certainty without documentation is just opinion. The admission date on the record was the admission date. I was certain. Now I had paper to confirm it. What I also knew, Tuan had signed documents he had not been told the full truth about. He had signed thinking I had agreed. He had signed because his brother had told him it was procedural, routine, already handled. Min had used Tuan's distance and his trust to obtain a signature under false pretenses. What I did not yet know, whether this was Min's initiative, or Lin's, or both together. Whether the estate papers Lin wanted me to sign were connected to these documents Tuan had signed. Whether there were other documents I had not yet seen. Whether the notary Mr. Fook had stamped them knowing the dates were wrong. Or whether he had been deceived as well, and if so, how. What I suspected, that the lacquered box had not been misplaced. That Duke's notebook was not in the house. That someone had understood, perhaps before I did, that the notebook was the problem, that a handwritten will in my husband's unmistakable hand, witnessed and dated, would complicate everything they were building. And so the notebook had been removed. Not lost, removed. I put the hospital record back in its folder, folded the folder carefully and placed it inside the box of documents under the bed, different box from Duke's lacquered one. This was a plain cardboard box, the kind that holds paper reams, the kind no one looks twice at. Then I went to the front room, to the bookshelf Duke had built over the course of 3 weekends, the one with the third shelf 2 millimeters low on the left side. I stood in front of it for a moment, looking at his books, their spines faded and familiar. On the very bottom shelf, behind a row of engineering manuals Duke had kept for 30 years and never discarded, I reached into the back corner and withdrew a small notebook of my own, not his, mine. The one I had kept during my years in the credit division for exactly this kind of moment, a record-keeping habit so old it was nearly unconscious now. Dates, names, reference numbers, observations, the things a mind holds that a page holds better. I opened it to a blank page, wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote the 2 dates, the notarization date, and the hospital admission date side by side, with a single word between them. Impossible. Then I wrote the name Lin had given me. The notary. The office on Tran Hung Dao. I had spent 34 years in banking, and I knew exactly how fraud survived, not because it was clever, but because no one looked at the right document at the right time. Someone had looked. I wrote one more thing in the notebook before I closed it, something that had been at the edge of my thinking since the night before, a detail I had not yet been able to explain, a detail that made the shape of what I was seeing larger and more deliberate than I had initially allowed myself to believe. Duke's signature on the hospital consent forms the ones from his admission, the ones I had signed alongside him during the brief window when he was still lucid enough to authorize his own treatment, was dated the same week as the notarization stamp on Tuan's documents. But the signatures were different. I had held my husband's hand for 31 years. I had steadied his notebook while he wrote his final instructions. I knew that signature the way I knew the chipped corner of the ceramic teapot and the third shelf of the bookshelf and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway at night. The signature on the hospital forms was his. The signature on Tuan's notarized documents was not. I did not confront anyone that day. Instead, I did what I had always done when a loan application felt wrong before I could articulate exactly why I started pulling threads. Not the big ones. Not yet. The small ones. The loose ends that people leave because they never imagine anyone will look carefully enough to find them. The first thread was Mr. Fuck. I knew the street Lin had mentioned. Tran Hung Dao, near the Central Market. I knew that area well. I had walked through it hundreds of times over the years, had eaten at a noodle stall on the corner for most of my working life, had passed the row of small professional offices tucked between the shops and the pharmacies without ever having reason to stop at any of them. The kind of street that exists in every Vietnamese city, functional and unremarkable, the kind where people conduct the administrative business of their lives without anyone paying particular attention. I told Lin I was going to visit a friend. She looked up from her phone with that quick assessing glance she had, the one that lasted less than a second but missed nothing. "Do you want Min to drive you?" "I'll take a taxi," I said. "I enjoy the ride." She accepted this. She was careful never to push too hard on small things. This was one of the more sophisticated aspects of what she was doing, though I doubted she thought of it in those terms. She simply understood instinctively that control maintained through small allowances feels less like control. I took a taxi to Tran Hung Dao. I walked past Mr. Fuch's office twice before I went in. It was a narrow shopfront, the kind with a glass door and frosted lower panels, a sign with his name and credentials in the window. The credentials looked real. They usually do. Inside, a young assistant sat at the front desk. I told her I was inquiring about estate notarization services. General inquiry, I said. My husband had recently passed. I was trying to understand the process. She was helpful and bored in equal measure. She explained the procedures. She mentioned pricing. She said they handled many estate cases, very straightforward usually. The main requirement was that all parties be present and documents be original. All parties present in person? I asked. For any document affecting property transfer, yes. The notary must verify identity and confirm understanding. It's the law. She said this with the slight recitation quality of someone repeating something they have explained many times. And if someone is unwell, if they can't come in, then we go to them, if it's necessary. Home visits are possible. But all parties must be conscious and able to confirm understanding. We document this. She paused, perhaps sensing something in my stillness. It's very strictly regulated. Of course, I said. Thank you. I did not ask to see Mr. Fuch. I did not ask about specific cases. I had what I came for, a confirmation of what I already knew to be true. Home visits were possible. All parties must be conscious and able to confirm understanding. Duke had been neither conscious nor able during the days surrounding that notarization date, which meant either Mr. Fuch had notarized documents without completing the required verification, or he had never been to the hospital at all and someone had brought him paperwork that was represented as completed when it was not. Both possibilities were serious. One of them was worse. Tuan arrived the following afternoon. I had asked him to come. I had said only that I needed help with some things in the house, which was true in its own way, and he had rearranged a meeting and driven up from Da Nang without asking for more explanation. This is the thing about Tuan, he does not require reasons. He trusts that if I am asking, there is a reason worth trusting. He looked tired when he arrived, thinner than at the funeral, the particular thinness of someone who has been working too hard and not eating well. He hugged me at the door and I held on for a moment longer than usual, which surprised him, because I am not a person who holds on. Mom, he said quietly. What's happening? Come sit with me, I said. I need to show you something. We sat at the kitchen table. Lin and Min were out. Lin had mentioned something about a property viewing, one of her real estate clients, and Min had gone with her, which had become their habit, the two of them moving through the world as a unit in a way that left increasingly little room for anything else. I laid out what I had: the hospital admission record, the photograph of the notarization date on the documents Tuan had signed, my notebook with the two dates written side by side and the word between them. I explained carefully and in order, the way I would have explained a discrepancy to a junior loan officer. Here is what the document says. Here is what the record shows. Here is why these two things cannot both be true. Tuan listened without interrupting. He looked at the documents for a long time. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't. Min said you had agreed. He said you were overwhelmed and had asked him to handle things. I agreed to nothing. I was told nothing. His jaw tightened. The documents I signed, what do they actually transfer? Administrative authority over the estate. The right to make decisions about the property on behalf of the family. I paused. Without those documents, any property transaction would require both of our signatures and mine. With them, Min or whoever holds administrative authority can act alone. The implications settled over the table like a change in air pressure. There's more, I said. I told him about the lacquered box. About the missing notebook. About the estate papers Lin wanted me to sign, produced without explanation, connected to a notary I had not been introduced to. About the signature on the documents, the one that was not his father's. Tuan was quiet for a long time after I finished. Outside the courtyard, the mango tree moved in a small wind. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle. the kind that makes ordinary rooms look briefly beautiful. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need the notebook first," I said. "The handwritten will. Without it, the typed documents are the only record. Do you think they destroyed it?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it carefully, turning it over the way you turn an object in your hands to check every surface. "No," I said. "Not yet. Documents like that, you don't destroy them until you're certain you don't need them. If a question came up, if someone challenged the typed version, having the handwritten one to produce and then discredit would be useful. Or they might not have understood what they had." Tuan looked at me. "Where do you think it is?" Before I could answer, I heard the front door open. Lin's voice in the entryway, bright and carrying. "We're back." The property was lovely, actually. Tuan and I looked at each other. He moved the documents off the table, onto his lap, below the line of sight from the doorway. I closed my notebook and set my hands flat on the table. Lin came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Tuan. The expression that crossed her face lasted perhaps half a second. It was not surprise exactly she would have known Tuan's car outside. It was something faster and more involuntary than surprise. Something that looked, for just that half second, like the expression of a person who has been running calculations and has suddenly encountered a variable they did not include. "Tuan," she said warmly, "I didn't know you were coming. Last-minute trip," he said. "I wanted to see Mom." "Of course." She moved to the counter, began filling the kettle, her back to us. Her movements were perfectly natural. Perfectly controlled. "I'll make tea." "Are you staying for dinner?" "Yes," Tuan said. I watched the back of her neck, the way she stood, the angle of her shoulders. And then I saw what I had not seen before, or rather, I understood what I had been seeing and not yet interpreting correctly. On the counter beside the refrigerator, half obscured by her handbag, was a phone I did not recognize. Not Lin's usual phone. Older, smaller, the kind of secondary device that people keep for specific purposes they prefer not to associate with their primary number. She moved her bag as she reached for the tea canister. The phone disappeared underneath it. That alone I might have set aside. But as she turned to take cups from the cabinet, I saw her eyes go to Tuan's lap just for an instant. Just a flicker where the documents were hidden. She could not have known they were there. She could not have seen them from her angle. But she looked. And in that look was the specific quality of a person checking on something they have already been told about. I thought, someone told her Tuan was here before she came through the door. I thought, the phone on the counter was not for her real estate clients. And then I thought of something else, something Tuan had said in passing, something I had half registered and set aside to examine later. He had said Min called him 3 weeks ago about the paperwork. That Min had sent documents by courier, but the notarization date on those documents was 8 months ago. If Min had only contacted Tuan 3 weeks ago, 8 months after the documents were supposedly notarized, then those documents had been sitting somewhere for 8 months, completed and waiting, before Min had moved to use them. Waiting for the right moment. I looked at Lin's back. At the handbag on the counter. At the shape of what I had been assembling piece by piece since the morning I had found a clean rectangle in the dust where a box used to be. It was larger than I had thought. It was more deliberate than I had allowed myself to believe. And somewhere in this house, or in an office on Tran Hung Dao, or in a place I had not yet thought to look, there was a document that would tell me exactly how long they had been planning this and what they had done to make certain I would never be able to prove it. I picked up my tea, took a slow sip. Lin set the cups on the table and smiled at me. I smiled back. Tuan left the next morning before Lin was awake. We had arranged this the night before, sitting in the courtyard after dinner while Min watched television and Lin cleaned the kitchen with the thoroughness of a person who does not want to give anyone reason to complain. The mango tree was dark above us, its fruit still small and hard at this time of year, and we spoke in low voices the way we had when the boys were children and did not want to wake their father. I gave Tuan 2 things before he left. The first was the hospital admission record, not the original, which I kept, but a photograph I had taken with my phone and printed at the shop around the corner on the pretext of printing family pictures. The second was a name. My former colleague at the bank, a woman named Mrs. Chow who had retired 2 years before me and whose daughter was now a practicing attorney specializing in civil and property law. I had already called Mrs. Chow the previous afternoon from the taxi on the way home from Tran Hung Dao, keeping my voice light and my words general. Catching up, I had said. It has been too long. Mrs. Chow was sharp. She had been sharp for 40 years, and retirement had not softened her. She said her daughter would call me. The daughter called that same evening, while Lynn was occupied with her secondary phone in the bedroom with the door closed. Her name was Attorney Nguyen Bik Nok, and she had a voice like her mother, direct, no wasted syllables. I explained the situation briefly and in order, the same way I had explained it to Tuan. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you have the original will? The handwritten one?" "Not yet," I said. "That's the center of everything. Without it, we're arguing against documents that exist in favor of documents that don't. It's possible, but harder." "I understand. Find it if you can," she said. "In the meantime, I'll pull the notary registration records for Fuck's office. Notaries are required to log every document they process, date, parties present, reference number. If that notarization date doesn't appear in his official log, or if it appears with discrepancies, that's our entry point." "How long will that take?" "A week, maybe less. These are public records." I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat with my phone in my lap and the quiet house around me and thought about what she had said. Entry point. In banking, we had called it the same thing. The one number that didn't reconcile. The one date that opened everything else. My neighbor Mrs. Lan came to visit the following Thursday. She is 70 years old and has lived across the lane for longer than I have lived in this house. She knew Duke's parents. She knew Duke. She had been at our wedding and at our son's school performances and at the funeral, where she had stood beside me for the entire service without speaking, which was more useful than anything she could have said. She came with oranges, which is what she brings when something is on her mind, because she is the kind of person who needs an object in her hands when she has something difficult to say. She set the oranges on the table and looked at me with the directness of a woman who has known me long enough to skip the approach. "I've been wanting to talk to you," she said. "Then talk," I said, and made tea. She told me she had been home the afternoon. She named a date I recognized immediately, a date in the month after Duke died, when she had seen a car she didn't recognize parked in front of the house. Two men she had never seen before, carrying what appeared to be a document case, going inside. They had stayed for perhaps 40 minutes. When they left, Lynn walked them to the car. "Min wasn't here," Mrs. Lan said. "Just Lynn." "And you, where were you that day?" I thought back. That date was the day I had gone to the district office to file the death registration paperwork. I had been gone for most of the afternoon. "I was out," I said. Mrs. Lan nodded slowly. "I didn't think much of it at the time. But then last week I saw Tuan here, and the way everyone looked at the table when I came to say hello, and I thought she picked up an orange, turned it in her hands. I thought maybe I should tell you. Do you remember anything about the car? The men? One of them had a document case with a government seal on it. The red and gold kind. Official looking." She paused. "And the other one was older. Gray hair, a stamp pad in his breast pocket. The kind notaries carry." She looked at me with eyes that had seen 70 years of things and drawn their own conclusions. "I thought you should know," she said again. After she left, I sat with my tea and thought about what it meant. Mr. Fook or someone from his office had come to this house on a day I was absent, had come with documents, had spent 40 minutes inside, had left with Lynn walking them to the car. A home visit, the assistant had said. Home visits are possible. But Duke had already been dead for several weeks by that date. There was no one to visit. The only purpose of a notary's presence in an empty house, empty of the person whose authorization was required, was to complete paperwork that had already been prepared. To add a stamp to something that did not legally warrant one. I wrote the date in my notebook, Mrs. Lan's name, her description, the document case, the stamp pad. I found the copy by accident, which is to say, I found it because I had been looking for something adjacent and my eyes recognized what my hands had not yet reached for. I was going through the filing cabinet in the small room off the hallway, the one Duke had used as a study, which Min had been using since moving in, though he kept it neat enough that the intrusion was not immediately obvious. I had a reason to be there. I was looking for the original property deed, the one I had found under the bed, to compare it against a document I had since requested from the land registry office. This was legitimate. No one could object to a widow looking for her own property deed. The filing cabinet had 4 drawers. The bottom drawer stuck, which I remembered, and I pulled it with the particular sideways jerk that Duke had always used. Inside were project folders from Minja's work, organized by year. I was not interested in these, but behind the last folder, flat against the back of the drawer, was a manila envelope, unsealed. I noted this. A sealed envelope might have meant private correspondence. An unsealed one was something someone had accessed recently and not bothered to reseal, because they did not expect anyone else to open the drawer. Inside the envelope were photocopies, not originals copies. The quality of documents photographed and reprinted, slightly reduced, the edges not quite centered. I recognized the first page immediately. The typeface, the format, the language. It was the estate document Lynn had placed on the table beside my husband's altar and asked me to sign, the one I had not touched. But this was not the version Lynn had shown me. This was an earlier version. A draft, perhaps, or a previous iteration because several lines were different. Slightly different language in 2 of the clauses. A different reference number in the header. And at the bottom, instead of the notarization stamp I had seen on the document Lynn had presented to me, there was a handwritten notation in the margin, 4 words and a number. I read them twice to be certain. Then I took the envelope to the kitchen table, photographed every page with my phone, replaced the envelope exactly as I had found it flat against the back of the drawer, behind the last folder, and pushed the drawer shut with the sideways jerk. I went to the courtyard. The mango tree stood in the afternoon light, its roots reaching down through the clay and tile of the courtyard, invisible and necessary, holding the whole structure in place from beneath the surface. My grandmother had a saying about bamboo, about how it bends and bends in a storm until the watching sky thinks it will surely break, and then the storm passes, and the bamboo is simply standing there, as though nothing happened, because the root never moved. I had been bending for months. I had let them see what they expected to see. An old woman, tired, forgetful, easily managed. The root had not moved. The handwritten notation in the margin of the draft document contained 4 words and a number. The number was a file reference. The 4 words were a name I recognized, not because I knew the person, but because I knew the office. A name from the Department of Justice, the office that oversees notary licensing and disciplinary records. Someone had been checking Mr. Fuchs' record before any of this began. Not me. Not Tuin. The notation was in Lynn's handwriting. I had 40 years of practice identifying handwriting, and I had seen enough of hers in grocery lists and household notes to be certain. She had researched the notary before she used him. She had found something in his record, some previous irregularity, something that told her he was the kind of man whose flexibility could be relied upon, and then she had used him. I photographed the notation separately, enlarged it, sent it to Attorney NGOC with a single message. I think I know how they found him. My phone buzzed 10 minutes later. Jacques' reply was 4 words. I found his file. The letter arrived on a Monday. Formal envelope, cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs more than necessary because someone wants you to feel the weight of what's inside before you open it. My name on the front in printed type. No return address, but the postmark was from the district center, and when I opened it, I found a single page on letterhead. I recognized a law firm downtown. One of the larger ones, the kind whose name appears on billboards near the new commercial developments. It was addressed to me as the surviving spouse of Fan Van Duke, deceased. It informed me, in the careful language of people who make a profession of delivering unpleasant news in acceptable packaging, that a formal estate settlement had been initiated, that the administrative representative named as Min had engaged the firm to facilitate the process, that as a surviving dependent, I was entitled to residential rights in the family home for the duration of my natural life, at the discretion of the estate representative. At the discretion of the estate representative. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I set the letter on the table and looked at it the way I used to look at loan applications that had been carefully constructed to obscure what they were actually asking for. They were not giving me the house. They were giving me permission to stay in it. Permission that could, in theory, be reconsidered by Min. By whoever controlled Min. I called Attorney Ngok. I received it, I said when she answered. They've filed. I know. I was going to call you this morning. Her voice had the focused quality it took on when she was working. They moved faster than I expected. Someone is pushing the timeline. Ling, I said. Probably. The filing was made 4 days ago. The same day Tuan visited you. I thought about this. About Lin's eyes going to Tuan's lap. About the secondary phone. About how quickly information had moved. They know Tuan came, I said. They know something changed. This filing is a pressure tactic. They want you to feel like the process is already complete, already beyond your ability to interrupt. She paused. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to the letter directly. Give me 3 more days. What happens in 3 days? I finish pulling Fuchs' disciplinary file, and I have a contact at the land registry who owes me a professional courtesy. I want to know if any transfer documents have already been submitted. After I ended the call, I sat with the letter and thought about what Ngok had said. A pressure tactic. Something designed to make me feel that the walls had already closed, that the only reasonable response was to accept what I was being offered, the small, conditional version of what had always been mine, and be grateful for it. I thought about the timing. 4 days after Tuan's visit, they had been watching, and they had decided that movement on my side required acceleration on theirs. Good. Acceleration meant pressure. Pressure meant mistakes. Min came to speak with me that evening. He came alone, which was unusual. Lin was in the kitchen but not present, which told me she had positioned herself to hear without appearing to direct. He sat across from me at the table with his hands folded and his eyes on a point slightly to the left of my face, the way he had looked as a boy when he'd done something he knew was wrong and had decided to commit to the story anyway. Mom, he said, I wanted to explain the letter before you worried about it. I'm not worried, I said. He blinked. This was not the response he had prepared for. It's just procedural. The lawyers need to formalize things so everything is in order. It protects you. How does it protect me? It clarifies your rights, your right to stay in the house, everything official. He had rehearsed this. I could hear the smoothed over quality of it, the way words feel when someone has said them to themselves in the shower, until the edges are gone. You don't have to do anything. Just let us handle it. I looked at him. At the jaw that was his father's and the eyes that were looking at that point beside my face instead of at me. Your father wanted both you and Tuan to inherit equally, I said. Something moved in his expression. Fast and controlled. Dad wasn't clear about that at the end. He was confused a lot of the time. He was not confused the Tuesday afternoon he wrote it down. The silence was brief and had a particular quality, the quality of someone deciding how much to confirm. Mom, he said, with the patience of someone addressing a person of limited understanding, these decisions are complicated. There are tax implications, property valuations, legal structures, things that are better handled by people who understand the process. You shouldn't have to carry this. There it was again. The same script, a different voice, but the same words underneath. You are too old. You are too tired. You cannot carry this. Let us. I folded my hands on the table. All right, I said. Thank you for explaining. He left looking relieved. Relief, in my experience, is the most dangerous thing to let a person feel prematurely. The following Saturday, Lin invited 2 women over for lunch. I had seen them before, neighbors from the newer part of the neighborhood, the houses built in the last decade, the kind of neighbors one cultivates rather than simply has. They arrived at noon, and the lunch stretched to 3 in the afternoon, moving from the kitchen to the front room, the conversation loud and comfortable in the way conversations are, when everyone present feels they are in agreement about the nature of things. I sat with them for the first hour because it would have seemed strange not to. I drank tea and answered questions and listened to the shape of what Lin was building. She spoke about the estate process in passing, as though it had come up naturally. Such a complicated time, she said. Poor Mom has been so overwhelmed. You know how it is after so many years together. The grief affects everything. Even simple things become difficult to process. We're trying to take as much off her plate as possible. It's what family does. The 2 women murmured agreement, looked at me with the particular sympathy reserved for elderly people navigating things slightly beyond their capacity. I smiled and said nothing. Lin refilled their tea and touched my arm with the practiced warmth of a person constructing a record. In front of witnesses, establishing a version of events that could be recalled later, if needed, by people who had no reason to question it. Poor Mom. Overwhelmed. Grief. Simple things become difficult. After they left, she turned to me with a smile, that did not reach the full distance to her eyes. It was nice, wasn't it? Good to have company. Very nice, I said. She began clearing the cups. Her movements were efficient, satisfied, with the quality of someone wrapping up a task they'd completed successfully. Mom, she said. Her back to me. The lawyers need a response to the letter by the end of the month. It's really just a formality. I can sit with you when you sign if that would help. You're very thoughtful, I said. She turned and looked at me, and for a moment the smile relaxed into something more genuine, not warmth, but the expression of someone who believes a difficult problem is resolving itself. We just want what's best for you, she said. She said it the way people say things when they have stopped worrying about being believed. That evening I sat in front of Duke's altar for a long time. The incense smoke rose and dispersed. 3 sticks, as always, the ash holding its shape in the still air. His photograph watched from behind the flame, the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the slightly right-leaning signature that I would know in any company, in any light, set against any forgery. I thought about what the last 2 weeks had produced: a letter asserting control, a son delivering a rehearsed speech, a lunch staged for witnesses, the apparatus of a plan that had been in motion for longer than I had understood, arriving now at what its architects believed was the final stage. They had the signed documents from Tuan, obtained by deception. They had the notarized estate papers, fraudulently stamped. They had a law firm filing on their behalf. They had constructed, in the eyes of neighbors and in the language of legal correspondence, a portrait of an elderly woman too overwhelmed by grief to manage her own affairs. What they did not know was that Attorney Nyok had spent the past 10 days pulling every document Fuchs' office had logged in the relevant period and had found 3 entries that did not appear in the public registry, which was not only irregular but illegal, and which Nogok described in her message to me that evening with 2 words: prosecutable discrepancies. What they did not know was that Tuan had driven back to Da Nang and spent 4 days going through every document he had received by courier and had found, in an envelope he had set aside and nearly discarded, a folded piece of paper he had not initially examined, because it appeared to be packing material. He had photographed it and sent it to me at 11 o'clock that night. It was a page torn from a small notebook. The handwriting was careful and slightly right-leaning, the D in the signature looping once before closing. I held my phone in both hands and looked at it for a long time. It was my husband's handwriting. It was not his will, only a single page, a fragment, something torn loose and accidentally enclosed. But it was dated, and the date was the Tuesday afternoon I remembered, and the words at the top of the page, in Duke's careful engineer's print, were the names of both his sons, equal portions, the house to remain in the family. In Tuan's careless envelope, accidentally mailed to Da Nang with the fraudulent documents, they had sent the very thing they had stolen. They did not know it was missing. I set my phone down on the table beside Duke's altar. I looked at his photograph for a long moment. Then I picked up my gold pen and opened my notebook. There were things to arrange, and I did not have much time. Nok called me on a Wednesday morning, 9 days before the end-of-month deadline on the lawyer's letter. I was in the courtyard when the phone rang, standing beside the mango tree with a cup of tea I had not yet drunk, watching a small bird work at something in the bark near the low branches. The morning was cool, the kind of cool that arrives in the hours before the city fully wakes, when the air still holds the memory of the night before. I had been standing there for some time. I had not been sleeping well. I need you to come to my office, Nok said, no preamble. Today, if possible. There are things I can't explain over the phone. This afternoon, I said, come alone. I told Lin I was visiting Mrs. Chow. This was not entirely untrue. Mrs. Chow's building was 2 streets from Jock's office, and I had in fact sent her a message that morning asking how she was, so the architecture of the story was sound. Lin nodded and offered Min as a driver, and I declined with the same pleasantness I had been maintaining for weeks, the pleasantness of still water, and took a taxi. NGOC's office was on the 4th floor of a building near the courthouse. Small, efficient, the desk covered in the organized density of someone who works across many cases simultaneously. She stood when I came in and shook my hand with both of hers, which told me before she said anything that what she had found was serious. She sat me down and opened a folder. I'm going to show you several things, she said. In order. I need you to look at all of them before you respond. I set my hands in my lap. Go ahead. The first document was Fuchs' disciplinary file from the Department of Justice. Nizak had been right, there was a previous irregularity. 7 years ago, a complaint had been filed against his office by a family in the district, a case involving a property transfer document that had been notarized with a date discrepancy. The investigation had concluded with a formal warning and a 3-month suspension of his notary license. He had not lost the license. He had been cautioned and reinstated. Lin found this, Ngok said. The notation in the margin of the draft document, you photographed the reference number, it's from this disciplinary case. She pulled the file the same way I did. She knew, before she ever contacted him, that he had done this before and had survived it. I looked at the warning letter. Fuchs' name at the top. The language of bureaucratic consequence that falls just short of real accountability. He knew what she was asking, I said. He had done it before. For different clients, different circumstances, same structure, documents notarized on dates when the authorizing party was unavailable. Last time it was a man who had emigrated and was supposedly authorizing a sale remotely. This time it was your husband. She paused. He agreed to do it again because the first time had cost him 3 months and a fine he'd absorbed. He calculated the risk was manageable. I thought about the stamp pad in his breast pocket. The 40 minutes in this house while I was filing paperwork across the city. Show me the rest, I said. The second document was a bank record. I recognized the format immediately. I had spent 3 decades reading documents in this format. It was a transaction history for an account I did not recognize, not mine, not Duke's household account. A separate account opened in Duke's name 11 months before he died, at a branch I had never used. I looked at the dates, the opening deposit, the subsequent transfers. Where did this come from, I asked. The land registry inquiry led to a cross-reference with estate asset declarations. When Min filed the estate paperwork, he was required to declare all assets. He declared this account. Njok's voice was careful, precise. But the account was opened without your knowledge, and the transfers out of it began 4 months before your husband died. I looked at the amounts. They were not small. The transfers went to an account I did not recognize. I looked at the account name. I read it twice. Lin's name, her personal account. 12 transfers over 4 months. Systematic, regular, the kind of movement that does not look like theft when you are the person doing the moving and the account you are moving from belongs to a man who is dying and whose wife is occupied with caring for him and is not checking the secondary account she did not know existed. I put my finger on the first transfer date. Duke had been ill, but not yet bedridden, still walking, still taking short trips with help, still capable on good days of sitting at the table and eating and following a conversation. Not capable, I was now understanding, of monitoring a bank account that someone else had access to. How did she have access? My voice was level. I was working to keep it level. The account was opened jointly. Your husband's name and Min's name. The documentation for the joint opening. And Njok paused and slid a paper across the desk. The documentation is signed by your husband, but the date of the application is from a Tuesday. I cross-referenced it against the hospital records you sent me. I looked at the date. It was the same Tuesday Duke had dictated his instructions, and I had steadied the notebook and watched him write both sons' names in equal portions and sign his name with the D that looped once before closing. The same day. The same Tuesday afternoon when Duke had been home with me, writing in his notebook, planning the future with the precision of a man who knew his time was limited and intended to use it well. On that Tuesday, according to these documents, he had also been at a bank branch across the city, opening a joint account with his elder son. He wasn't there, I said. No, Ngok said quietly. He wasn't. I sat with that for a moment. The small bird I had watched in the mango tree that morning had been pulling something loose from the bark. Patient, precise, returning to the same spot until it found what it was after. I had watched it without knowing why I was watching. Now, sitting in Ngok's office with the transaction history in my hands, I thought about what it means to be taken from while you are occupied with something else, while you are watching the sky, believing the tree is safe. Duke had been dying. This is the thing I kept returning to. The thing that sat at the center of all the other things and made them heavier. He had been dying, and he had been using his clarity, his careful engineer's mind in its final deliberate weeks, to write down his wishes for the people he loved, to make sure the record was right, to make sure no one could argue about what he had intended. And while he was doing that, while his hand shook and I held the notebook steady, someone in this family had been using his name, Ming. I thought about my son's jaw, his father's jaw, the jaw that had been looking at a point beside my face during our conversation about protecting me. I thought about being 7 years old and falling off a bicycle and crying on the sidewalk, and how Duke had told me once that Min had never told anyone when he cried as a small boy, had always gone somewhere private, had always hated being seen as anything less than in control. I thought about the look on Min's face at Duke's funeral, the expression I had interpreted as grief, and now, with the transaction history in my hands, was no longer certain how to read. I was his mother. I had held him before he had language. This was the person who had learned, somewhere along the way, that his father's dying was also an opportunity. Or perhaps he had not learned it on his own. The transfers to Lin's account, I said. Did Min know they were going there? Njok's expression answered before her words did. The transfers were initiated from a device registered in Lin's name. There's a digital access record. Min's login was used to open the account. Lin's login was used for every subsequent transaction. So Min had opened the door. Lin had walked through it repeatedly, alone, and taken what was inside. I did not know whether this made it better or worse. I sat with it and could not decide. NGOC slid one more paper across the desk. This is the one I need you to look at last, she said. Take your time. It was a photograph. She had printed it from the digital file her land registry contact had pulled. It was a photograph of a document, an application for property title transfer, filed 3 weeks ago, 2 days before the formal lawyer's letter arrived at my door. The property was the house, my house. The house Duke's parents had built before the city expanded outward to surround it. The house with the thick old walls and the pale yellow exterior, and the mango tree in the courtyard, and the bookshelf in the front room with the third shelf 2 millimeters low on the left side. The application listed the transferring party as the estate of Fawn Van Duke. The receiving party was a company name I didn't recognize. I looked at Ngok. It's a shell company, she said, registered 8 months ago. The registered agent is Lin's younger brother. They were not planning to keep the house. They were planning to sell it. Not to Min, not to the family, to a company that existed on paper and belonged, at a remove of 1 degree, to Lin's family. The entire structure of the estate documents, the administrative authority, the notarized papers, the letter about my residential rights at the discretion of the estate representative, all of it had been built toward this. They were going to sell my husband's house, the house his parents built, the house where Min and Tuan had grown up, the house where Duke had died on a Tuesday morning with me on one side and the window on the other, and they had intended to do it while I lived in it. With my conditional permission, at their discretion, not fully understanding, until it was already done. I set the paper down on Ngok's desk, slowly, carefully. The way I had set down my pen on the table beside my husband's altar the afternoon. Lin had told me I was too old to understand documents. My hands were not shaking. I noted this with a distant kind of attention. The part of me that observes even when everything else is occupied with something enormous. My hands were not shaking. They were completely still. What do we do? I asked. Nok had been watching me with the careful attention of someone who has delivered difficult news before and understands that the response that follows silence is more telling than the one that follows the blow. We file to invalidate the notarization, she said, on the grounds of the date discrepancy and Fuchs' documented history of the same violation. We present the fragment of the handwritten will as evidence of original intent. We challenge the property transfer application as fraudulent, using the bank records as evidence that the estate assets were already being misappropriated. She paused. And we move quickly. The title transfer application has a processing window. If we file a challenge before it clears, the registry will freeze it pending investigation. How long do we have? 11 days. I looked at the photograph of the transfer application. At the house that had been in Duke's family for decades, reduced to a line of text in a document filed by a company that did not exist 11 months ago. Then we start today, I said. And I picked up my pen. I went home from Jacques' office the same way I had come. Taxi, window down, the city moving past in the late afternoon light. The same streets I had walked for decades. The same shop fronts and temple gates and street vendors setting up for the evening. Familiar in the way that things become familiar when you have lived alongside them long enough that you stop seeing them and simply know they are there. I looked at all of it carefully on the ride home. Deliberately. The way you look at things when you are preparing to act and want to remember who you were in the moments before. I had 11 days. I had spent 34 years building the habit of precision, and I intended to use every one of those years in the next 11 days. The first thing I did when I arrived home was cook dinner. This is not a small detail. I had not cooked dinner in this house in several months. Lynn cooked. Lynn organized the kitchen with the authority of a person who has decided that occupation is ownership, and I had allowed this, had eaten what was set in front of me, had thanked her and meant the thanks and said nothing about the arrangement. Tonight I went into the kitchen while she was in the front room and I made soup, the kind Duke had liked, the kind I had made for 30 years on evenings when the air turned cool. I knew where everything was in this kitchen. It was my kitchen. I had simply been borrowing it back. Lynn appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected variable. "Mom, I was going to make dinner." "I wanted to cook tonight," I said pleasantly. "It helps me think." She watched me for a moment, recalibrating. Then she smiled and said that was lovely and went back to the front room, and I listened to her footsteps and the quiet sound of a message being sent from her phone, and I continued making soup. I needed them comfortable. I needed the next 11 days to look exactly like the previous weeks, the pleasant dinners, the gentle conversations, the portrait of a household running smoothly toward an agreed resolution. Disruption would make them cautious. Caution would make them careful. Careful people hide things more thoroughly and act more quickly, and I could not afford either. So, I made soup. And I called Min to the table. And I listened to Lynn talk about a property she had viewed that afternoon. Something about a location near the new development. Good investment potential, she said, and I agreed that it sounded promising and asked appropriate questions and ate my soup. Duke's photograph watched from the altar room doorway. I did not look at it during dinner. I was saving that conversation for later, when I was alone. After dinner, I went to my bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed with my notebook. Noak and I had spent an hour in her office after the documents, planning. She had been methodical, and I had matched her precision point for point, which I think had surprised her slightly. She was accustomed, I suspected, to clients in distress, to people who needed the structure provided for them. I did not need structure provided. I needed a partner who could move quickly and document everything. We had divided the work. Noak would file the challenge to the property transfer application at the land registry first thing Thursday morning. This was the most time-sensitive element. The 11-day window was the binding constraint, and everything else had to be arranged around it. She would also prepare the formal complaint against Fuchs' notary license, attaching the disciplinary record and the date discrepancies, and submit it to the Department of Justice. My work was different. I opened my notebook to the page where I had been keeping my list and added 3 new items. Then I went through what I already had, checking each piece against what Ngok and I had discussed, making sure I understood not just what I was holding but exactly how each piece fit into the structure we were building. The hospital admission record, the foundation. It established that the notarization date fell within a period when Duke was incapacitated, and it was an official document that no one could argue with after the fact. I had the original and 3 copies, stored in separate places. The page from Duke's notebook, the fragment Tuan had found in the courier envelope. The handwriting, the date. Both sons named in equal portions. Not the complete will, but a fragment that corroborated the existence of different intentions than what the typed documents claimed. Jacques would submit it with a handwriting analysis request. The bank transaction records from Knox contact. 12 transfers, 4 months, Lynn's name on the receiving account, initiated from Lynn's device, all while Duke was alive and the account was supposedly his. The draft document I had found in the filing cabinet, the earlier version with Lynn's margin notation, the reference number pointing to Fuchs' disciplinary file. This established premeditation. It showed that Lynn had researched his vulnerability before approaching him. Mrs. Land's account of the two men arriving at the house on the afternoon I was absent. She had agreed, when I called her after leaving in Jock's office, to provide a written statement. She had said, in her direct way, that she had been waiting for someone to ask. And Tuan's account of the phone call from Min, the documents sent by courier, the misrepresentation that I had already agreed, his signature obtained under false pretenses, his inheritance removed without his knowledge, his father's name used to do it. I wrote each item in the notebook with a line connecting it to the next. The shape that emerged was not complicated. It was actually very simple, which is what fraud tends to be when you lay it flat and look at it clearly. Simple and patient, and dependent on no one looking carefully at the dates. I closed the notebook and put it in the zippered interior pocket of my bag, the one I kept close. Over the following 4 days, I moved in the spaces between ordinary things. While Lin was at a client meeting on Thursday, I drove myself to the bank, my bank, the one where I had worked for 34 years, where the current branch manager had been a junior loan officer under my supervision for 6 years, and still stood when I came through the door and I sat with him, and asked about the process for contesting a fraudulent account. Opening. He listened with the focused attention of someone who takes the question seriously because of who is asking it. He told me which forms, which department, which timelines. He offered to connect me with the fraud investigation unit directly. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch within the week. While Min was at a site visit on Friday, I called Tuan. We spoke for an hour. I told him what Ngok had found. All of it. Without softening any part. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said he would come back to the city on the morning of the 8th day, which was when Ngok had scheduled the key filing, and I said that was exactly right. Saturday I spent in the courtyard. I weeded around the base of the mango tree, a task I had been meaning to do for weeks, and I thought about the property transfer application in the land registry, the application that named a shell company as the recipient of my husband's house, and I thought about the processing window ticking down, and in Jock's filing going in on Thursday, and what it would mean when the registry received a challenge and froze the application, and the first notification went to the law firm that had sent the cream-colored letter. They would know then. They would know something had moved. I wanted to be ready before that moment. I wanted everything filed and documented, and in Jock's hands before Lin's phone showed her the first sign that the ground had shifted beneath her. Once she knew, she would move quickly, and I needed there to be nothing left to hide or alter or remove by then. Every thread already pulled, every date already documented, every piece already where it could not be reached. Sunday, I cooked again. Duke's soup. This time, I made extra and brought a container across the lane to Mrs. Lan, who received it with the practicality of someone who does not make a ceremony of kindness. We sat in her small front room for half an hour. She told me she had written her statement, 3 pages, longhand, and asked who she should give it to. I gave her Njok's contact information. On my way back across the lane, I stopped at the gate and looked at the house. Old walls, pale yellow, the mango tree visible above the roofline. The house where Duke's mother had hung laundry in the courtyard, where his father had planted the tree, where my sons had been children, and where I had become the person I was, slowly, over decades, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. No one was selling this house. I went inside. Lit the incense at the altar. 3 sticks, as always, the smoke rising straight in the still air. I stood in front of Duke's photograph for a long moment, not speaking, just present. The way you stand with someone when there is nothing left to say that the silence doesn't already hold. Then I went to my room, opened my notebook, and checked the list one final time. Everything was in place. Everything was documented. Every date, every name, every piece of paper that proved what had been done and when and by whom and with what intention. In 3 days, Nyo would walk into the land registry with a folder that would freeze the transfer application and begin the formal unraveling of everything Lin had spent the better part of a year constructing. The morning after that, I had asked Min and Lin to be home. I had told them there was something I needed to discuss. I had told them calmly and pleasantly, the way I told them everything now, and they had agreed without suspicion because that was what I had spent the past weeks making them believe, that there was no reason for suspicion, that the old woman was tired and sad and managing, that the water was perfectly still. Storms do not announce themselves. They simply arrive. I set the table myself that morning. Not for food. I cleared the surface of everything that had accumulated there over the weeks: the mail, the fruit bowl, the small household objects that gather on tables in lived-in houses without anyone deciding to put them there, and I wiped it down with a cloth and set out only what I intended to use: my notebook, my pen, a folder containing documents arranged in a specific order, a second folder that Ngok had sent by courier the previous evening, sealed, which I had not opened at the table but in my bedroom at 11 o'clock at night, reading each page carefully before placing them back in sequence. I made tea for everyone. This was deliberate. The ritual of tea in the morning, the ceramic pot, the small cups, the ordinary comfort of it. I wanted the room to feel, in those first minutes, like any other morning. I had asked Tuan to come at 9. He arrived at 8:50 and I let him in quietly before Lin and Min were at the table. He looked at what I had arranged and said nothing. He sat in the chair to my left and folded his hands and waited, which is what Tuan had always done when his father was about to explain something. He went still and prepared to understand. Min and Lin came to the table together, as they always did, moving with the coordinated ease of two people who have been operating as a unit long enough that the coordination has become invisible to them. Min saw Tuan first. Something crossed his face fast, controlled, swallowed before it could be named. Lin's eyes went to the folders on the table, just for a moment, then back to neutral. Tuan, Min said. You didn't say you were coming. Mom asked me, Tuan said. I poured tea. Set a cup in front of each of them. Sat down, placed my hands flat on the table, and looked at the two people across from me. Thank you for sitting with me, I said. I'll try not to take too much of your time. I had thought about how to begin this for many days. I had considered beginning with the hospital record, or with the bank account, or with the fragment of Duke's handwriting that Tuan had found in the courier envelope. Each of these was a valid entry point. Each one established something specific and irrefutable and moved the conversation in a clear direction. But I had spent 34 years in banking, and I knew that how you open a file is not simply a tactical decision. It is a statement about what you understand, what you have been paying attention to, what you know that the other party does not yet know you know. So I began somewhere else. I opened my notebook to a page near the middle and read aloud the date Mrs. Lan had given me. The afternoon. 2 men with a document case and a stamp pad had arrived at this house while I was filing Duke's death registration across the city. I described what she had seen, calmly, in the same tone I would use to read a meeting summary. Then I closed the notebook. That was the afternoon the notarization was completed, I said. Not at Mr. Fuchs' office. Here, in this house. After your father had already been admitted to the hospital. I looked at Min. You knew he was in the hospital. You had driven him there yourself. Min's jaw tightened. The jaw that was his father's, doing something his father's jaw had never done, hardening against a truth rather than toward one. Mom, I'm not finished. My voice was level, not cold, not raised, simply continuing. The notarization date on the documents Tuan signed, and on the estate papers you've been asking me to sign, falls within the period your father was hospitalized. I have the admission record. I have a written statement from Mrs. Lan. And I have the disciplinary file of the notary. You engaged a man with a documented history of the same violation he committed in this house on that afternoon. Lin had not moved. She was sitting with her hands around her teacup and her face in a configuration I recognized from our dinner conversations, the face of someone who is calculating while appearing to be listening. I turned to her. Mr. Fuchs' office log does not contain an entry for our address on that date, I said. Attorney Nguyen Bich Nok submitted the inquiry to the Department of Justice 3 days ago. The discrepancy is now part of a formal investigation into his notary license. The teacup in Lin's hands did not move, but her knuckles changed color slightly. You've been talking to a lawyer, she said. Her voice was careful, not quite steady. For some time, yes. Mom. Min leaned forward. You don't understand how complicated these estate processes are. The paperwork. The timelines. We were trying to protect you from having to manage all of that. The notary, the dates, there are explanations for all of Min. I said his name the way I had said it when he was a boy, and had given me a story that didn't reconcile. Not unkindly. simply with the specific weight of a person who is waiting for you to stop. He stopped. I opened the first folder. I placed the documents on the table in order, the way I had arranged them in my bedroom the night before. The hospital admission record first, then the photograph of the notarization date, then the bank transaction records 12 transfers, 4 months, the receiving account in Lynn's name, initiated from Lynn's device. I set each one flat on the table without comment. The way you set out evidence in a document review, here it is. Here is what it says. You can look at it or not, but it exists regardless. Lynn looked at the transaction records for a long moment. That account was for household expenses, she said. We discussed it with your husband. He agreed. He was at home with me on the day that account was opened, I said. The same Tuesday afternoon he wrote his instructions for the estate. I have his handwriting from that afternoon. I placed Tuan's photograph of the notebook fragment on the table. Equal shares. Both sons named. His signature, which I watched him make, which any handwriting analysis will confirm is consistent with 30 years of documents and inconsistent with the signature on your notarized papers. Tuan was looking at the fragment of his father's handwriting. His expression was the one I had been carrying quietly inside myself for days, the particular grief of a person encountering something that should have been simple, that was made complicated by someone's deliberate choice. I let the document sit. Then I placed one more paper on the table, the property transfer application from the land registry, the shell company, Lynn's brother's name as registered agent. The application has been frozen, I said. A formal challenge was filed Thursday morning. The processing window has been suspended pending investigation. The sound in the room was the sound of a plan coming apart, not loudly, just the particular quality of silence that follows when something that has been in motion stops. Lynn set her teacup down. You had no right, she said. Her voice had changed. The careful warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and less considered. The voice of a person who has been certain of something for a long time, and is encountering for the first time the possibility of being wrong. You don't understand what we've been managing. The debts, the property values, you've been sitting in this house letting us carry everything, letting us handle everything. You don't even know what it costs to. She stopped herself, but not before it was said. I looked at her steadily. You told me I was too old to understand documents, I said. You said it standing in front of my husband's altar, with his incense still burning, while you held a pen you wanted me to use to sign away what he spent his life building. I paused. I understood every document you put in front of me. I simply didn't sign them. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard, the mango tree moved in a small wind. The ordinary sound of a morning continuing as mornings do, indifferent to what happens inside walls. Min had his face turned away from the table. His hands were in his lap. He looked like a man sitting inside a version of himself he had not examined closely in a long time and was now finding smaller than he had believed. The Department of Justice will contact Mr. Fuck within the week, I said. The bank's fraud investigation unit has been notified of the unauthorized account activity. Attorney Knock has prepared the formal contest of the estate documents on the grounds of fraudulent notarization. Antoine, I looked at my younger son, who met my eyes with the steadiness of someone who has been waiting to be on the right side of something. Tuan has provided a full account of the misrepresentation used to obtain his signature. I closed the empty folder, placed my pen on top of it. You told me I was too old to understand documents, I said again, quietly, not as an accusation now but as a fact, being set down alongside the others. I spent 34 years learning to read them. I was a branch manager. I train the people who caught your bank account, Lynn. I know how paper moves and where it leaves marks, and what a date that doesn't align means when you hold it next to the record. I folded my hands. I understood everything. I was simply waiting until I had all of it. Lynn spoke first. This did not surprise me. In my experience, the person who moves first after a silence like that one is always the person with the most to lose and the least capacity to sit with uncertainty. Min had gone somewhere interior, somewhere behind his eyes, the place men go when they are confronted with something they have not decided how to survive. Lynn did not have that capacity for stillness. She had always been a person of motion, of management, of filling silence before it could fill with something worse. This is not what it looks like, she said. Tuan made a small sound, not quite a laugh. The sound a person makes when words arrive so insufficient to the moment that language briefly seems like the wrong tool entirely. Lynn. My voice was even. I have the bank records. The account was for the household. I told you. We needed a separate account for the expenses while your husband was sick, the medical costs, the medications. The transfers began 4 months before he entered the hospital, I said. The account was opened on a Tuesday when he was home with me. And the receiving account is yours. Not a household account, not a joint account, your personal account, in your name only. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Furthermore, I continued, the transfers follow a pattern I recognize from my years in banking. Regular, systematic, small enough individually that they would not trigger an automatic review, but consistent in frequency and in amount. This is not how people manage medical expenses. This is how people move money when they do not want the movement noticed. The room held what I had said. Lynn looked at Min. It was the look she had been giving him for years. I understood now, the look that meant, say something, handle this, you are the son, she is your mother, use that. The look that had been the engine of all of it, because Min's need to have Lynn look at him that way, to have someone believe he was the one managing things, had been the crack through which everything else had entered. Min did not look back at her. He was looking at the fragment of his father's handwriting in the center of the table. I had wondered, in the days of preparation, how Min would respond when he saw it. The fragment was not large, a single page, the corner slightly torn where it had separated from the notebook, Duke's engineer's handwriting clear and unhurried across the lines. Both sons named. Equal portions. The date in the upper right corner, the same Tuesday, the same afternoon. His father's hand. His father's intention, written while his father still had the clarity to intend things precisely. Min reached out and touched the edge of the paper. Not picking it up. Just touching the edge, the way you touch something you thought was gone. He wrote this the last month he was home, Min said. His voice had changed. The practiced quality was absent, the smoothed-over, rehearsed version gone. What remained was quieter and less managed and, I thought, more honest than anything he had said to me in a very long time. I knew he was writing something. He wouldn't tell me what. He told me, I said. I know. He withdrew his hand from the paper. I knew then too. That's why he stopped. Looked at the table. Lynn said that whatever he wrote wouldn't hold up, that a handwritten document without proper witnesses wasn't valid, that the typed version, properly notarized, would supersede it. That is not accurate, I said. Handwritten testamentary documents have legal standing, particularly when supported by corroborating evidence of intent. I didn't know that. You didn't verify it, I said. Not harshly. There is a difference. He absorbed this. Lynn pushed back from the table. The sound of her chair on the floor was sharp in the quiet room. This is between you and your family, she said. And her voice had shed its last layer of careful management and become simply cold. I was trying to protect our financial future. Min knew what the account was for. He agreed to it. If there's a problem with that decision, it's a decision he made. The room shifted. Tuan looked at his brother. Min looked at his wife. There are moments in a family that cannot be undone, not because of what happens in them, though what happens matters, but because of what they reveal. What was always true beneath the surface of the story everyone had agreed to tell. I had sat in enough mediation rooms to recognize this kind of moment. The moment when the version that had been maintained stops being maintainable, and each person in the room has to decide, very quickly, what they are willing to be responsible for. Min decided. You used my login, he said to Lynn. His voice was very quiet. For every transfer, I gave you access to manage the bills. You used it for something else. We discussed household expenses. He looked at the transaction records on the table. At the amounts. At the dates, Lynn. These go back to before Dad was even diagnosed. The temperature in the room changed again. I watched Lynn's face move through a rapid internal adjustment, the recalculation of someone who has been running a plan that depended on two parties remaining coordinated and has just understood that the coordination has ended. I don't have to sit here and sit down. Min's voice came out with an authority I had not heard from him in years. perhaps had never heard directed at her. "Sit down and tell me what you actually did." She did not sit down, but she did not leave. What came out over the following 40 minutes was not a confession in the formal sense. It was the more complicated thing, the piece-by-piece emergence of a plan that had been larger and older than I had fully understood, even with everything No had found. Lynn had begun thinking about the house 2 years before Duke died. Not because she had known he would die, then she had not known. None of us had known how quickly it would move, but because she had looked at what existed and made a calculation. The house was valuable. The neighborhood had changed around it, the new developments pushing property values upward, the old house sitting on land that developers would pay well for. Duke had no formal estate plan that she could find. His wife worked in a bank and was careful and organized, and would be difficult to mislead. But grief, Lynn had apparently calculated, was a solvent that could soften careful people. She had found Fook through the disciplinary records, as I had inferred. She had approached him not as a notary but as a person with a specific professional history that could be referenced. He had understood what she was asking, and had provided a number, which I now had through Ngok's contacts and which the Department of Justice's investigation would find independently. The shell company had been her brother's idea, a layer of distance. The plan had been to complete the title transfer quickly, before anyone looked carefully at the estate documents, and then sell the property to a developer who had already been in preliminary conversation with her brother for 3 months. She had told Min it was for their future. She had told him it was protection, financial security, the responsible thing to do with an asset that was sitting underutilized. She had told him his father's wishes, whatever they were, couldn't supersede the practical realities of what the family needed now. She had not told him about Fook. She had not told him about the shell company. She had not told him about the developer conversations. These things came out the way blocked water comes out when the pressure becomes sufficient, not all at once, but in increments, each one forcing the next. Min's questions pulling threads that Lynn had not expected to pull, because she had not expected to be in a room where anyone was asking. By the end, Min was sitting with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Tuan said nothing. He had been silent for most of it, watching with the expression of someone filing things carefully away, the son who had always been looking for the right path rather than the shortest one. Lynn stood near the doorway. Not quite in the room, not quite out of it. "I need to call someone," she said finally. It was the first time I had heard her voice sound uncertain about what came next. "You should," I said. "Attorney Knox filing is already in. The registry freeze is in place. The Department of Justice inquiry has been opened. You should speak to a lawyer before any of those processes move further." She looked at me. For a moment, something crossed her face that I had not seen there before, not anger, not calculation, not the practiced warmth she had maintained for months. Something simpler and less defended. Almost, I thought, the look of a person who has been running for a long time and has just understood that the running has not taken them anywhere except here. "You were never going to sign those papers," she said. "No," I said. "You knew. From the beginning." "From the beginning," I said. "I knew what I was looking at. I simply needed time to document it properly." "You told me I was too old to understand documents." I looked at her steadily, without heat, the way you look at a closed account. "I spent 34 years understanding documents. That does not stop because my hair turned white." She left the room without responding. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, the bedroom door closing, the sound of a call being made to someone I did not know and would not need to. At the table, Min lifted his face from his hands. He looked at Tuan first, then at me. His father's jaw. His father's shoulders. None of his father's ease. "Mom," he said, and then couldn't find what came after it. "Not today," I said gently. "There will be time for that. Not today." I picked up my pen, set it in my pocket, began gathering the documents back into their folder, slowly, each one in order, the way you close a file that has been properly resolved. Outside, the city continued. Motorbikes and voices, and the ordinary morning sounds of people who did not know what had just happened in this room and had no reason to. The mango tree in the courtyard, unhurried, its roots still holding everything in place from beneath the surface. The account was not yet closed, but the numbers, finally, were beginning to reconcile. The legal process took 4 months. I will not detail every step, because the steps were numerous and procedural, and most of them happened in offices I did not need to visit more than once. Njok handled the documentation with the efficiency I had expected of Mrs. Chaw's daughter. The Department of Justice completed its investigation into Fuchs' notary license in 6 weeks. The license was revoked. The criminal referral to the district prosecutor followed 11 days after that. Fuchs hired a lawyer and attempted, briefly, to characterize the irregularities as administrative errors. The prosecutor was not persuaded. The trial date was set for the following spring. The estate documents, the typed, fraudulently notarized versions that Lin had prepared and Min had signed and that had been waiting, fully assembled, for me to be tired and grieving enough to accept, were invalidated by the civil court in the 8th week. The handwriting analysis of Duke's notebook fragment, submitted alongside my account of the Tuesday afternoon and corroborated by the hospital records, established that his intentions were clear, documented, and predated the fraudulent versions by 8 months. The property transfer application was formally withdrawn. The shell company was dissolved. Lin's brother cooperated with the investigation in exchange for reduced civil liability, which meant the developer conversations were documented and disclosed and became part of the record. The bank returned the transferred funds, all 12 transactions, plus interest, plus the penalties assessed against the account that had been opened in Duke's name without his meaningful authorization on the day he was home with me, writing in his notebook, planning for the people he loved. Lin left 2 weeks after the morning at the kitchen table. She did not leave dramatically. She packed in stages, over several days. While Min stayed mostly at a site his company was managing on the other side of the city, there were no scenes, no raised voices. The house was very quiet during those 2 weeks. The particular quiet of something that has been resolved but not yet absorbed. On the day she finished, she came to find me in the courtyard. I was weeding around the base of the mango tree again, a task that never fully completes itself, which I have come to understand is the point. She stood at the edge of the courtyard with a bag over her shoulder and looked at me for a moment without speaking. "I misjudged you," she said finally. I sat back and looked at her. She was thinner. The managed quality that had always been present in her bearing the deliberate presentation of a person who has decided how to be seen was less evident. What was underneath it was harder to read, but more real. "You saw an old woman," I said. "You thought what people often think when they see an old woman. That the years are a subtraction. I was wrong." "Yes," I said, not harshly, simply as a fact. She nodded once, the way people nod when they are accepting something they cannot change, and walked back through the house and out the front door. I went back to the weeding. The house was formally transferred into my name and Tuan's name jointly, as Duke had intended, with the same provision for Min that Duke had written into his instructions, a 1/3 share held in trust, available to him when certain conditions were met. The conditions were mine to set, and I set them carefully and without cruelty. Not punishment, simply structure. The thing Min had always needed more of, and had been given less of than was good for him. He came to see me in the 3rd month, alone, on a Sunday afternoon when the light came through the front window at the angle that made the old bookshelf look golden. He sat at the kitchen table where he had sat his whole life and looked at his hands for a while before he said anything. "I told myself I was protecting our future," he said. "I believed it, or I made myself believe it. I'm not sure anymore which one is true." "That is a question worth sitting with," I said. "Don't rush past it." "I didn't know about Fook. Or the company. I want you to know that." "I know," I said. And I did know, because Ngok's investigation had established the boundaries of Min's knowledge with the specificity that legal processes require. He had opened the account. He had signed the documents he had been told were procedural. He had allowed Lin to manage the details because allowing Lin to manage the details was what he had been doing for years, and he had stopped examining what that meant somewhere along the way. This is its own kind of culpability. Different from Lin's, less deliberate but not absent. "What do I do?" he asked. "You start with what's true," I said, "and you work forward from there, carefully, one document at a time." He looked up. Something moved in his expression, the recognition of a person who hears in someone else's words the echo of something they were taught a long time ago. Duke used to say exactly that. About any problem, any project, any structure that needed to be built or rebuilt. Start with what's true. Work forward from there, one level at a time. Min knew he had heard it before. I watched him remember where. Tuan came with his family in the 4th month, after the last court proceeding closed. His wife and their 2 children, who were old enough to run in the courtyard and young enough to find the mango tree endlessly interesting. Tuan and I sat on the low bench near the tree while the children climbed what was climbable and tested what was testable, and the afternoon moved at the pace afternoons move when there is nothing urgent demanding from it. Dad would have enjoyed this, Tuan said. He would have been assessing the structural integrity of their climbing methods, I said. Tuan laughed. A real laugh, the kind that releases something. And then he would have climbed up to demonstrate the correct technique. And then he would have been unable to get down without help. We sat with that for a while. Mom, Tuan said eventually, what you did all of it, the months of preparation, the documentation, staying quiet while you put everything in place, how did you know you could hold all of that, without letting anything show? I thought about the question, about the long weeks of dinners and pleasant conversations and careful maintenance of a surface that gave nothing away, about lighting incense each morning in front of Duke's photograph and carrying what I knew back to my room each night and opening my notebook and checking the list. Your father used to say that an engineer doesn't build from the top, I said. You build from the foundation, and you don't add the next level until the one beneath it is sound. I did the same thing. Each piece of evidence had to be in place before the next one could hold weight. I couldn't rush it, and I couldn't let the weight show before the structure was complete. Tuan looked at the mango tree. His children had abandoned climbing in favor of examining something in the bark, the same bark I had watched the small bird working at on the morning before everything began. It held, he said. It held, I agreed. That evening, after Tuan's family had gone home and the house was quiet again, I lit the incense. 3 sticks! The ash holding its shape in the still air. Duke's photograph behind the flame, the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the expression of a man who is perpetually about to remember something important. I had bought new incense that week, the old kind, the kind with the particular smell that I associated with this room and this house, and the 31 years of mornings I had begun this way slowly, before the rest of the household woke, in the particular quality of early light that comes through the courtyard window when the city is still deciding to begin. I stood in front of the altar and did not speak. There was nothing to report that I thought he did not already know, in whatever way the dead know the things that happen after them. The house was still standing. Both sons were provided for. The record was correct. These were the things he had wanted, simple things, when you wrote them down. The kind of things that should not require 4 months of legal proceedings and a gold pen and 34 years of learning to read documents, but sometimes do, because the world contains people who look at what someone has built with patience and love and see only what they might extract from it. I thought about bamboo. I had thought about it often over these months, the image returning to me at unexpected moments during depositions, during the quiet hours before dawn, during the dinners where I had smiled and poured tea and let them believe the water was still, the bamboo bending in a storm until the watching sky thinks it will surely break, and then the storm passing, and the bamboo simply standing there, as it always was, because the root never moved. The storm had passed. I was still standing. I set my hand lightly on the edge of the altar, the worn wood that had been in this family longer than I had, that had held photographs and incense, and the accumulated attention of people who understood that the relationship between the present and the past deserves a dedicated place in the house. Outside, the mango tree was still in the evening air. The courtyard was dark and quiet. The city moved at its own pace, indifferent and continuous. The way cities are. I looked at Duke's photograph one more time. 34 years of learning to read what was written between the lines. 31 years of building something worth protecting. Months of staying still while everything moved around me, bending without breaking, waiting for the moment when all the pieces were in place and the structure was sound enough to hold the truth. I picked up my gold pen from the altar table, where I had placed it that morning without quite knowing why, and turned it once in my fingers. Then I said goodnight to my husband, and turned off the light, and went to bed. And in the dark, before sleep, I thought the thing I had been thinking since the beginning, since the afternoon, in front of his altar when she held out the pen and told me to sign, when the incense smoke rose between us and I looked at her and said nothing and understood everything. Still, water runs deepest, and the deepest water is the last place you want to be standing when it finally moves. If anyone has ever looked at you and seen only your age, only your gray hair, only the quiet way you move through a room, know this: stillness is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. The ones who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. They never were. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them is for people like you. In the comments, I'd love to know. Have you ever had to stay silent while you gathered your strength? And did that patience eventually pay off?